In this video, we're going to introduce some aspects of global politics. Global politics is a state of anarchy. And anarchy doesn't necessarily mean chaos, but it means a lack of hierarchy. Hierarchy means there is an ordinal relationship between constituent parts. Individuals or firms or organizations, somebody or something is in charge of other things or other people. That's not how global politics works. There is no such thing as a single global government. Rather, it's a state of anarchy. There are just multiple relationships between states, but nobody, no organization is in charge. And as a result, what will often happen is great powers emerge to exert their influence. And they build relationships that sometimes compete with other groups that happen to have relationships with each other. Great example of this would have been the Cold War. And during the Cold War, there were two great power blocs. There were the United States and their allies, which focused on open markets and democratic governments. And on the other side was the Soviet Union and their allies. And the Soviet Union was really centered around Russia and its affiliated states. And those two competed with each other. And it's called a Cold War because often the competition was through propaganda. It was a battle of ideas. But there was also some funding of proxy wars. So there might be a dispute in a country in South Asia or Africa, and each side would funnel weapons to the other to try and indirectly influence the outcome. So it was never a hot war with actual shooting between these two great parties, but it was a Cold War fought with ideas and propaganda, and sometimes through proxy conflicts. Now, that provided some semblance of stability until the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, what the Berlin Wall is an actual wall that was built between East and West Berlin. There used to be two Germanys at the Olympics, East Germany and West Germany. One was communist and the other one was affiliated with the Democratic bloc and the Americans. And there was a physical wall that separated East Berlin and West Berlin. And the wall wasn't really to keep people out, it was to keep the East German citizens in. If they tried to escape and escape to freedom in the West, they would often be shot in this, a visual example here of the no man's land between the two sides. Until November 1989, the East Germans decided they would no longer patrol the wall, they would no longer enforce mobility restrictions, and the Berlin Wall came down, and both sides of Germany were reunited. And that caused a bit of a domino effect. Other states also started to leave the communist bloc of the Soviet Union and look for their own independence. Czechoslovakia split into Czech Republic and Slovakia. Yugoslavia broke up into a bunch of different constituent parts. Poland left the Soviet Union to become independent. So this was a period of a lot of change, turmoil, and conflict as countries left the Soviet Union, which was largely controlled by Russia. This period prompted what's called democratization. It was a period of increasing the number of democracies in the world, as a lot of these states left the umbrella of the authoritarian Soviet Empire and they wanted to embrace democratic governance in some form or another. Samuel Huntington documents this, calls it the different waves of democracy. This was democracy's third wave. The second wave coming after the Second World War, when, again, through the decolonization and a lot of new states gained their independence. So there was an explosion in the number of democracies in the world. Same thing happened after the end of the Cold War. A lot of new countries in the world. So this gives a new dynamic to global politics. No longer is it a matter of two great powers checking each other. Really, there's only one, and that's the United States. The Americans were the single global power, a unipolar world. There's only one great power, and they spend a lot more on defense than many others. So throughout this time, multilateral and other global organizations rose to prominence. They became more important because other countries needed a way to try and cooperate and to manage the influence of the United States. The United States also wanted to use these organizations to try and get what it wanted too. NATO was one example, the European Union, the G7, the G20, World Trade Organization, the Arab League. These are all different groups of countries that agree to come together to cooperate on different issues. Some of them, like NATO, is a collective security agreement. Others are more focused on trade and economics. Now, there are many different ways of trying to achieve elements of global governance because there is no single global government. There are international organizations that can do things like NATO and the European Union. They can embrace free trade, they can promote collective defense. There are treaties and conventions. Countries might agree to sign treaties with each other and they would all mutually be bound by this agreement to ban landmines or certain types of weapons. Those are some examples of treaties. There are international courts, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, though their effectiveness can be debated. And customs, a lot of international law predates the emergence of borders. So if in many countries, for example, like Africa, that have a colonial history, before borders were drawn, there were a lot of trade routes and migration patterns that predated the establishment of borders. So in many ways, the locals there kind of observe their own customs rather than what we would call modern governance. And so custom does form a big part of international law. Probably the best example of a global government or a global governance organization would be the United Nations. It's the closest thing that exists to a global government, although it does not function that way. It is more a multilateral community of countries rather than a global hierarchy. So just to recap, there is no such thing as a global government or global authority. It is a state of anarchy. That just means lack of hierarchy. Sometimes great powers might emerge and wane. You might have two great powers in a bipolar world, or it might be just one country that is the most powerful in a unipolar context. So international organizations try and fill that void. They emerge to try and provide elements of governance, but not a single global government.